The Gulf, the Shallows, the Deeps by Caroline Ennis. As a fourth-generation local to the coastline of the Florida Panhandle, the Gulf of Mexico is a great and constant driver in my work. My thematic influences are honed from my knowledge of the Gulf that was taught to me by generations of my family and expanded through my experiences on the water. I approach the Gulf of Mexico waters with installation and sculptural methods using ceramic, fiber, drawing, and unfired clay. In Lore of the Local, Lucy Lepard explores place and ideals of being local in a way that resonates with my connection to the Gulf of Mexico. Lepard states, it demands extensive visual and historical research, a great deal of walking in the field, contact with oral tradition, and an intensive knowledge of both local multiculturalism and the broader context of multi-centeredness. Is it the body of water itself that I am drawn to, or is it the memories, the way of life, and the people that keep me tied to it? Lepard quotes artist Marlene Creates. The land is important to me, but more important is the idea that it becomes a place because someone has been there. Being local allows one to have an identity with location. Locals pride themselves on knowing specific, learned information about their home. For instance, a local fisher will know the tide and time of day that will bring the passing mullet to swim under their dock. They will also know what time of year the speckled trout will eat a DOA shrimp lure. A local understands the ways of the land and water they occupy better than any outsider or traveler. The use of fish netting in my work was born from my desire to utilize a symbol or object that I could use to tie together my connection to the shallow and familiar waters of the Gulf. The nets have since continued to reveal themselves in my work, standing in as a real and metaphorical connecting point for my localness with the Gulf of Mexico. Passing one is a long, sinuous floating form that suggests the shape of a mysterious sea creature found in the deepest regions of the sea. A net is like a tool because it catches, traps, and holds things. A net can take many shapes by hanging, draping, pulling, and stretching. Artist Ronnie Horn captures the essence of water through photography, sculpture, and poetry. Horn is intrigued by the darkness or the blackness of opaque water, specifically found in the River Thames in London. Despite the River Thames being her main source of inspiration for water, she continually speaks of water as an entity that is non-containing and is ever present all around us and inside us. I am drawn to thinking of water as a source for poetic thought and how we can reflect ourselves through the water. Horn asks us to consider, when you see yourself reflected in the water, do you recognize the water in you? Large bodies of water are areas that can be easily overlooked or out of sight, out of mind. For most, enduring the open ocean's elements are not a part of the everyday human experience. In turn, the open sea becomes an unknown, foreign place devoid of lengthy, sustainable living conditions. Telling of sea monsters lurking in the depths, Ray Bradbury writes, "No, it only hid away in the deeps, deep, deep down in the deepest deeps." Isn't that a word? It says so much. The deeps. There's all the coldness and darkness in a word like that. The fascination and mystery of the vast waters of the Gulf of Mexico led me to focus on the emotions that cloud the perceptions of unfamiliar territories. In the Obstruction Drawings Bodies of Water series, I utilized topographical maps of the coast and blocked out the bodies of water with dark paint. This work aims to serve as a visual representation of emotions that are associated with the immense depths of unexplored oceans. Shallow and deep water explorations provide profoundly different experiences from which I correlate personal and poetic metaphors. Shallow water is personal, visible, and familiar, whereas deep water is distant, unseen, and imagined. In the piece, Search Rebuilding the Pier, I am commemorating the process of rebuilding my weathered family pier. The unfired clay eventually dries and cracks, revealing the life cycle of materials that live in close proximity to salt water. I began learning to read sonar screens at a young age for deep sea fishing. I was always intrigued by the possibilities that the digital pixelated sonar screen could show me. Used recreationally, sonar is generally used to communicate water depth, reveal underwater terrain, and schools of fish. Just as I have been intrigued with topographical coastal maps, I have a great interest in studying maps and technology that show the terrain of the Gulf of Mexico's seafloor. Even with advancements in mapping and sonar technology, there is still a sense of imagination needed when envisioning a distant watery landscape. In my piece, Deep Sonar, I aim to create an imaginative rendition of the Gulf of Mexico's seafloor, of which I have only seen through sonar screens and paper maps. Deep Sonar is based on my research of underwater mapping technology, with a combination of my longing to imaginatively envision the far-reaching landscapes of the Gulf of Mexico seafloor. I am a local to the coastline of the Northwest Florida Panhandle, but I consider myself a stranger to the Gulf of Mexico's seafloor, as I have only seen the far-reaching domain through bathymetry maps and sonar. If we cannot fully experience life under the deep abyssal sea, are we able to comprehend its beauty and complexity? My thesis, The Gulf, the Shallows, the Deeps, includes 3 tall, glazed, ceramic sculptures that abstractly depict the topography of the Gulf of Mexico's seafloor, and handmade fabric nets influenced from my family's tradition of cast net fishing along the shallow coastline. In my research, I recall experiences I have had offshore as well as my research of scientific seafloor mapping. I begin by looking at bathymetry maps of the Gulf of Mexico and sonar, specifically paying attention to the deep lines, textures, and colors that indicate depth. My research-based experiences took place during deep-sea bottom fishing. Bottom fishing requires a heavy weight that will take your bait and fishing line to the bottom of the seafloor. When your weight hits the bottom, you feel a slight bump and a slack in the fishing line. The fishing line acts as a transmitter between 2 very distinct and distant worlds. While sculpting the obscure clay forms in the Gulf, the Shallows, the Deeps, I tried to perceive the seafloor as I did with the fishing line. The forms were created intuitively without the use of an exact reference or sketch. The ceramic sculptures contain surface content relating to marine growth, fishing nets, and bathymetry map contour lines. When developing the glazes for this work, I was thinking about the different colors associated with varying depths of water. The surface of Woven in the Shallows seafloor contains the outlines of fishing nets. The light blue-green and streaks of amber suggest a shallow seafloor that is closer to the surface. This work specifically references my family's use of fishing nets in shallow water. Seagrass-dwelling seafloor was influenced by rock and coral formations I have seen while diving. Underwater formations with a rough surface often contain and attract marine life. The surface contains a rugged texture with a bright green and dark blue glazed palette, suggesting a mid-range water depth. The sleek, glossy surface and glowing in the deeps sea floor closely relates to bathymetry maps. The bulbous surface contains no definite texture but is instead lined with carvings that resemble the contour lines on a map. The cool glaze palette of electric blue with flashes of crimson suggests a deep abyssal region that can only be seen with the map. The fabric installation, casting our nets, is made of hand-dyed muslin and a thick green monofilament line. Each fabric piece contains a unique hand-cut pattern that resembles a fragment of fishing net. The green monofilament line is tied to the nets with a traditional fishing knot called a uni knot. The nets are hung in the air just as they may drift along the currents of the sea. My thesis is a culmination of 3 years of academic research that sources from a lifetime of personal experiences on the water, specifically the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf, the shallows, the deeps reinforces my local connection to the Northwest Florida Panhandle coastline and inspires my metaphorical and poetic approach to the complexities of water. My abstract approach is based on my perception of the seafloor viewed through bathymetry maps and sonar. My fascination with the imagined underwater world will continue to influence my artistic practice. Thank you for your time.